Winston Churchill's life traced an arc from neglected aristocratic child to controversial soldier and politician to wartime prime minister and Nobel Prize-winning writer, and finally to elder statesman in retirement. Across these stages, he combined public action with prodigious literary output, leaving behind not only a political legacy, but millions of words of history, biography, and oratory. His story is inseparable from the great conflicts of the 20th century, yet it also illuminates how a single personality used language, spoken and written, to shape both events and memory. Early years and family background. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on 30 November 1874 at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, the ancestral home of the Dukes of Marlborough. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a rising conservative politician and the younger son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American socialite, giving Churchill a mixed British-American heritage that later mattered for his sense of the English-speaking peoples. Churchill's childhood was emotionally difficult. He later recalled feeling neglected by his parents, finding affection mainly from his devoted nurse, Mrs. Everest. At Harrow School, he did poorly in most academic subjects, especially Latin and mathematics, which reinforced his father's decision to steer him toward a military career rather than the classical path expected of many aristocratic sons. After enrolling in the Army class at Harrow, Churchill focused on gaining admission to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, failing the entrance exam twice before finally passing on his third attempt in 1893. Once there, he applied himself seriously and graduated 20th out of 130, a marked contrast with his earlier record. Commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars in 1895, Churchill was determined both to see active service and to make a name for himself. With the help of family connections, he arranged to report as a war correspondent while serving as an officer, beginning a pattern of combining military experience with journalism and book writing that would characterize his early career. His first significant postings included British India, where he served on the northwest frontier and wrote The Story of the Malacan Field Force, 1898, a polished account based on his dispatches. He then took part in the Anglo-Sudan War, riding with Lord Kitchener's forces and witnessing the Battle of Omdurman. This campaign produced the River War, 1899, an ambitious 2-volume history that already showed his taste for strategic analysis and grand narrative. Seeking further adventure, Churchill went to South Africa as a correspondent during the Second Boer War, was captured in an ambush, and made a dramatic escape from a POW camp, an episode that brought him wide public attention in Britain. By 1900, Churchill had left the regular army and used the fame from his books and speeches to enter politics, winning a seat in Parliament as a Conservative MP for Oldham. Yet military affairs remained central to his identity and later ministerial roles, especially at the Admiralty and in wartime leadership. Early political career and World War I, Churchill's pre-World War I political career saw him shift parties and offices, while cultivating a reputation as energetic, ambitious, and controversial. Disappointed with the conservative leadership, he crossed the floor to join the Liberal Party in 1904 and held several cabinet posts, including President of the Board of Trade and Home Secretary. In October 1911, Prime Minister H. Asquith appointed him First Lord of the Admiralty, placing him in charge of the Royal Navy at a time of intense Anglo-German naval rivalry. As First Lord, Churchill promoted naval modernization. He supported the transition from coal to oil fuel, reorganized the Admiralty, and championed new warships. insisting Britain must outbuild Germany to maintain command of the sea. When World War I began in 1914, he oversaw fleet mobilization and early operations, including troop transport to France and a blockade of Germany. However, his role in the failed Gallipoli campaign, an attempt to force the Dardanelles and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, damaged his reputation severely. After heavy losses, he was forced out of the Admiralty in 1915. Churchill briefly served on the Western Front as a battalion commander, seeking to redeem himself through personal risk, before returning to politics later in the war. In the interwar years, he held several posts, including Chancellor of the Exchequer, but by the 1930s, he was largely out of office and out of favor, partly because of his opposition to Indian self-government and his criticism of government policy. Yet this wilderness period allowed him to write extensively and to warn, long before most colleagues, about the dangers of Nazi Germany's rearmament. On 3rd September 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany after the invasion of Poland, Neville Chamberlain recalled Churchill to government as First Lord of the Admiralty. The signal, "Winston is back," was circulated to the fleet, recalling his earlier tenure. As the war in Europe deteriorated with German victories in Norway and France, Chamberlain's position collapsed. On 10th of May 1940, Churchill became Prime Minister at the head of a coalition government, just as German forces launched their Western offensive. Churchill's wartime premiership, 1940-1945, made his reputation as one of the 20th century's most significant leaders. Facing the fall of France and the threat of invasion, he rejected peace feelers and rallied Britain with speeches that emphasized defiance and endurance. Most famously, "We shall fight on the beaches" and "Their finest hour," combining realism about danger with confidence in ultimate victory. He cultivated close ties with U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, helping to secure Lend-Lease aid and pushing for America's full engagement against the Axis, and later worked with both Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin to coordinate Allied strategy. Strategically, Churchill sometimes clashed with his military advisors and allies, favoring Mediterranean and peripheral operations, North Africa, Italy, before a cross-channel invasion, and he remained deeply concerned about post-war balance of power, particularly Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Nonetheless, under his leadership, Britain survived the Blitz, fought on multiple fronts, and emerged in 1945 as one of the victorious powers, though greatly weakened economically and overstretched imperially. In the July 1945 general election, held just after victory in Europe, Churchill's Conservative Party suffered a landslide defeat to Labour. Clement Attlee replaced him as Prime Minister, a personal blow that he later described wryly but accepted constitutionally. Out of office, Churchill continued to speak and write, famously warning of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe in a 1946 speech in Fulton, Missouri, and urging Anglo-American cooperation to contain Soviet expansion. Second premiership and retirement, Churchill returned to power in 1951, winning the general election and forming a conservative government in which he again served as prime minister until 1955. His second term focused less on wartime heroics and more on managing Britain's post-war adjustment. He supported the early stages of European integration, navigated Cold War tensions, and sought détente where possible, while domestically accepting much of the welfare state built by labor. Health problems, including a stroke in 1953, limited his effectiveness, and in April 1955, he resigned as prime minister, succeeded by Anthony Eden, though he remained a member of parliament until 1964. In retirement, Churchill spent much of his time at Chartwell, his country home, painting, hosting guests, and writing. He maintained an active public presence through speeches and appearances, and his 80th and 90th birthdays were marked by extensive celebrations at home and abroad, recognizing him as a symbol of wartime leadership and Anglo-American partnership. Churchill died on 24th January 1965 at the age of 90. His state funeral drew dignitaries from around the world and was widely seen as closing a chapter on Britain's imperial heroic era. Parallel to his military and political careers, Churchill built an extraordinary life as a writer, which provided both income and a way of shaping his own and his nation's history. His literary work began with campaign narratives from India and Sudan, the story of the Malacon Field Force and the River War, and continued with London to Ladysmith via Pretoria and other Boer war books, which combined reportage, self-mythologizing, and strategic commentary. In 1900, he published his only novel, Savrola, but soon focused on nonfiction, biography, history, political essays, and collected speeches. Early major works included a biography of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, 1906, and Marlborough, His Life and Times, 1933-38, a multi-volume study of his ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, that also served as a reflection on strategy, leadership, and coalition warfare. After World War II, Churchill turned his experience into the Second World War, 6 volumes, 1948-1953, a sweeping narrative that drew heavily on documents and his own perspective, helping to shape public understanding of the conflict while naturally presenting himself in a central, often favorable role. His final major project, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples, 4 volumes, 1956-1958, traced the intertwined histories of Britain, the United States, and other Anglophone nations, expressing his long-standing belief in a transatlantic community of values and interests. In 1953, Churchill received the Nobel Prize in Literature for his mastery of historical and biographical description, as well as for brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values, recognizing not just his war memoirs, but the totality of his output, including speeches, histories, and biographies. Estimates suggest he wrote 8 to 10 million words across more than 40 books and countless articles and speeches, making writing not only his main source of income for much of his life, but also a way of wrestling with his own demons, his black dog of depression, and leaving a crafted record of his times. Churchill's life defies simple judgment. He was a fervent imperialist who opposed Indian independence, a politician associated with controversial decisions from Gallipoli to interwar gold standard policies, and a man whose attitudes on race and empire reflect his Victorian aristocratic upbringing. Yet he was also the leader who, at a moment of profound danger, articulated Britain's will to resist Nazi Germany in language that galvanized a nation and inspired allies, and a writer who turned political and military experience into narratives that still shape how millions understand the 20th century. His early years as a soldier and war correspondent forged the courage and appetite for risk that marked his later leadership. His long parliamentary career honed his oratory and political instincts. His wartime premiership showed how words and resolve can matter as much as material, and his retirement writings turned personal experience into public memory. If his life contains contradictions, it also illustrates how one individual, rooted in a specific class and empire, navigated an age of unprecedented upheaval and left behind both decisions and stories that continue to be debated by historians and the wider public alike. Franklin D. Roosevelt's life was marked by extraordinary privilege, profound personal challenge, and political transformation. Born into wealth and social prominence, he faced the crippling effects of polio at the peak of his early career, yet rose to become the longest-serving U.S. president, leading the nation through the Great Depression and World War II with innovative legislation and wartime leadership. His story intertwines family legacy, private struggle, masterful political maneuvering, and a vision of government as an active force for good. Early life and family wealth. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882, at Springwood, the family estate in Hyde Park, New York, overlooking the Hudson River. He was the only child of James Roosevelt I, a businessman, and Sarah Ann Delano, both from established New York families of Dutch and French Huguenot descent. James Roosevelt, born in 1828, had built a fortune through railroads, coal, real estate, and finance. He served as vice president of the Delaware and Hudson Railway and president of the Southern Railway Security Company before retiring to manage his estates and investments. Sarah Delano, 26 years younger than her husband, came from the wealthy Delano merchant family involved in the China trade in shipping. Her uncle Warren Delano II had amassed riches from the opium trade in Canton. The Roosevelts' wealth was rooted in 19th century America's economic boom. James's investments in railroads and urban property, combined with Sarah's family fortune, provided financial security that allowed young Franklin to grow up in relative isolation on the 600-acre Springwood estate, tended by servants and attended by tutors. His father's death in 1900, when Franklin was 18, left him an inheritance estimated at several $million, equivalent to tens of millions today, though much of the family wealth was tied up in trusts and property. Franklin's childhood was sheltered and adoring. Sarah doted on her only child, homeschooling him until age 14 and fostering his love of nature, sailing, and history. At Groton School, 1896-1900, he formed a close bond with headmaster Endicott Peabody, who instilled a sense of public service. Harvard, 1900-1904, was less formative academically, but he served as editor of The Crimson and graduated with a C average. Columbia Law School followed briefly, 1904-1907, but he left without graduating after passing the New York bar exam and joining the law firm Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn. Entry into politics and marriage. Politics beckoned early, thanks to family connections and Roosevelt ambition. In 1910, at age 28, he won election to the New York State Senate as a progressive Democrat, upsetting Tammany Hall machine politics with his support for labor reforms and public utilities. Appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy by President Woodrow Wilson in 1913, he oversaw naval expansion during World War I, championed preparedness, and gained national visibility, drawing comparisons to his distant cousin Theodore Roosevelt. On March 17, 1905, Franklin married Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, Theodore's niece and a distant cousin, in a union arranged partly by family. Eleanor, born in 1884, had a troubled childhood marked by her mother's death, her father's alcoholism, and her own insecurities, but she shared Franklin's reformist zeal. They had 6 children: Anna, 1906, James, 1907, Franklin Jr., 1909, died in infancy, Elliot, 1910, Franklin Jr., 1914, and John, 1916. Eleanor became a tireless social worker and later First Lady, but the marriage faced strains, including Franklin's affair with Lucy Mercer in 1918, which nearly ended it. Eleanor chose to stay for political reasons and family stability. Polio and political comeback. In August 1921, while vacationing at Campobello Island in Canada, Roosevelt contracted a paralytic illness that left him unable to walk without assistance. Initially diagnosed as polio, infantile paralysis, later analyses have suggested Guillain-Barré syndrome, but The effect was the same: paralysis from the waist down. For a rising politician in his prime, the diagnosis was devastating. Roosevelt spent months in therapy, using leg braces, crutches, and eventually a wheelchair in private, while publicly concealing his disability to protect his image. Supported by Eleanor, who took on public roles he could no longer fill, and by Lewis Howe, his political advisor, Roosevelt rebuilt his strength physically and politically. He purchased Warm Springs, Georgia in 1926 and turned it into a rehabilitation center for polio patients, finding both therapy and purpose there. In a letter to Dr. William Eagleston in October 1924, FDR wrote of his own experience. Please excuse my delay in replying to your letter, which has been forwarded to me down here in your neighboring state, where I am spending a few weeks swimming and getting sunlight for my legs. Gentle exercises, especially for the muscles of the back and abdomen, are of great value. In 1928, he won election as governor of New York, serving effectively despite his disability and implementing progressive programs like unemployment relief that foreshadowed the New Deal. 4 terms as president and the New Deal. The Great Depression propelled Roosevelt to the presidency. In 1932, he won a landslide victory over Herbert Hoover, promising a New Deal for the American people. Inaugurated on March 4, 1933, amid bank panics and 25% unemployment, Roosevelt acted decisively. In his first fireside chat, he explained the Banking Holiday and Emergency Banking Act, restoring public confidence. I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. He began assuring listeners, it is possible that when the people realize that the money they deposit in their banks will be there when they want it, confidence will be restored. The 100 days saw a flood of legislation. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, employed young men in environmental projects. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, paid farmers to reduce production. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, brought electrification and development to the rural South. The National Industrial Recovery Act, NIARA, aimed to stabilize industry through codes and public works. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, and later Works Progress Administration, WPA, provided direct relief and jobs for millions. The Social Security Act of 1935 created unemployment insurance, old age pensions, and aid for dependents. Roosevelt's 4 terms, re-elected in 1936, 1940, and 1944, were unprecedented, enabled by the Depression and war. The 22nd Amendment, 1951, later limited presidents to 2 terms.
We have at our disposal the national resources, the money, the skill of hand and head to raise our economic level, our citizens' income. Our capacity is limited only by our ability to work together.
The New Deal fundamentally expanded federal power, creating a welfare state and regulatory apparatus that defined modern liberalism, though critics on the left decried it as insufficiently radical and on the right as overreaching. Wartime presidency. As war engulfed Europe and Asia, Roosevelt shifted focus outward. The Lend-Lease Act 1941 aided Britain and others without direct U.S. entry, and after Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, he became the war leader, coordinating industrial mobilization, rationing, and the arsenal of democracy. With generals like George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower, he oversaw Allied strategy, meeting Churchill and Stalin at Tehran 1943 and Yalta 1945 to plan victory and post-war arrangements. Domestically, wartime production ended the Depression, employing women in factories, Rosie the Riveter, and interning Japanese Americans in a grave civil liberties failure. Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage on April 12, 1945, at Warm Springs, aged 63, just months before victory in Europe. Harry Truman succeeded him. Legacy as family man and leader, FDR's family life was complex. Eleanor became a global advocate for human rights, but their marriage was strained by his infidelities and her independence. They maintained a partnership of mutual respect. His children pursued varied paths, with son James entering politics and Elliot serving as a military officer. Roosevelt's legacy endures as architect of the modern American state. The New Deal's programs and wartime leadership preserved democracy amid crisis, reshaping government's role in economy and society while positioning the U.S. as a superpower. His ability to inspire through radio fireside chats and to navigate unprecedented challenges marks him as one of America's most transformative presidents. Joseph Stalin, born Iosif Vissarionovich Yugashvili, ruled the Soviet Union from the mid-1920s until his death in 1953, transforming it into an industrial superpower at the cost of millions of lives. His early life in poverty-stricken Georgia shaped a ruthless revolutionary. His political career involved cunning maneuvers to seize power. His wartime leadership turned the tide against Nazi Germany, and his post-war years saw renewed terror and isolationism. Stalin's era combined modernization, paranoia, and unprecedented repression, leaving a legacy of both Soviet survival and human catastrophe. Early life in Georgia, Stalin was born on December 18, 1878, Old Style December 6, in Gori, Georgia, then part of the Russian Empire, to Bessarion Jugashvili, a cobbler, and Ekaterine Galadze, a washerwoman and devout Orthodox Christian. His father, a former serf, descended into alcoholism and domestic violence after his shoemaking business failed, beating both his wife and son. Young Ioseb, nicknamed Soso, developed a tough, vengeful streak amid this harsh home. A childhood accident, perhaps a carriage run over, left him with a permanently withered left arm, and smallpox scarred his face. Ekaterine, determined to lift her son above poverty, enrolled him in Gori's church school, 1888-1894, where he excelled academically and learned Russian alongside Georgian. She then pushed him into the Tbilisi Theological Seminary in 1894, hoping he would become a priest, but Stalin was expelled in 1899 for non-appearance after revolutionary reading. Marx, Darwin, and radical pamphlets drew him to atheism and Marxism. In Tiflis, Stalin joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, RSDLP, in 1898 and aligned with Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik faction after the party split in 1903. He organized workers, wrote pamphlets, and edited the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda, Truth, adopting the name Stalin, Man of Steel, around 1912. To fund the party, he orchestrated expropriations, bank robberies, and extortion rackets in the Caucasus, including the 1907 Tiflis bank heist that netted 250,000 rubles but killed dozens. Arrested multiple times and exiled to Siberia, Stalin escaped repeatedly, honing his skills as an underground operative. The 1917 October Revolution elevated Stalin, appointed People's Commissar for Nationalities in Lenin's first government. He helped manage the multi-ethnic Soviet state, advocating national self-determination in theory while centralizing control in practice. In 1922, Lenin appointed him General Secretary of the Communist Party's Central Committee, a seemingly administrative role that Stalin used to build patronage networks, appoint loyalists, and compile dossiers on rivals. Lenin's stroke in 1922 and death in 1924 sparked a power struggle. Stalin allied first with Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev against Leon Trotsky, then turned on them, promoting socialism in one country against Trotsky's permanent revolution and outmaneuvering rivals through bureaucratic control. By 1927, Trotsky was exiled, Kamenev and Zinoviev demoted, and Nikolai Bukharin sidelined after opposing forced collectivization. Stalin's consolidation was complete by 1929. He had transformed a party of revolutionaries into his personal instrument. Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, the first two leaders of the Soviet Union, pursued economic policies shaped by Marxist ideology but diverging sharply in methods, goals, and human costs. Lenin's new economic policy, NEP, introduced in 1921, was a pragmatic retreat from rigid socialism to stabilize the economy after the Russian Civil War. Stalin's 5-year plans, launched in 1928, represented an aggressive push toward rapid industrialization and collectivization, abandoning NEP in favor of total state control. While both aimed at building socialism, Lenin's approach emphasized flexibility and recovery, whereas Stalin's prioritized speed and coercion, often at catastrophic expense. Both policies responded to crises. Lenin inherited the devastation of World War I, the 1917 Revolution, and the Civil War, 1918-1921, which caused famine, industrial collapse, and peasant revolts like the Kronstadt Rebellion. War communism, grain, requisitioning, nationalization, and central planning failed, leading to economic chaos and social unrest. Stalin, succeeding Lenin in 1924, faced a recovering but agrarian economy. He sought to match Western industrialization to prepare for war and achieve socialism in one country, rejecting Trotsky's global revolution. Introduced at the 10th Party Congress in 1921, NEP was Lenin's strategic retreat. It replaced war communism with limited capitalism under state oversight. Peasants could sell surplus grain after a tax in kind. Small businesses and private trade, netmen, were allowed. Foreign investment was encouraged via concessions. Lenin called it state capitalism, the last stage before socialism, arguing it would motivate production while funding socialism through taxes on private enterprise. NEP succeeded economically. Agricultural output recovered to pre-war levels by 1926. Industry grew modestly. Consumer goods reappeared. Politically, it preserved Bolshevik power by easing tensions with peasants, but created class tensions. Netmen profited while workers struggled, and ideological unease among hardliners like Stalin, who criticized it for fostering nationalistic and reactionary thinking. Lenin viewed it as temporary, defending it as necessary to repair the crumbling economy. Stalin ended NEP in 1928 with the first 5-year plan, 1928-1932. Targeting heavy industry, steel, coal, machinery, to build socialism rapidly. Subsequent plans, 1933, 1937, 1938, 1942, continued this with quotas set by Gosplan, State Planning Committee. Success was measured by output, not welfare. Collectivization forced peasants into kolkhozy, collective farms, liquidating kulaks, prosperous peasants, through deportation and execution. Industrialization succeeded quantitatively. USSR became a steel and tractor power, but at immense cost. Famines like the Holodomor killed millions. Labor was coerced via gulags and Stakhanovite shock work. Stalin justified it as essential for defense and communism, contrasting Lenin's caution. Lenin's NEP was pragmatic and gradual, accepting temporary capitalism to build foundations. Stalin rejected this as deviationist, demanding immediate forced transformation to overtake the West. NEP incentivized peasants with market incentives. Stalin's collectivization destroyed private farming, causing collapse and famine. NEP allowed private light industry. Plans focused on heavy industry via state directives, ignoring consumer needs. Lenin used persuasion and taxes. Stalin employed terror, purges, and camps. NEP restored growth without mass death. Plans industrialized but killed 10-20 million via famine and repression. Both were state-directed toward socialism, nationalized commanding heights, key industries, and used ideology to justify control. Lenin's Goel-Ro electrification plan prefigured Stalin's planning. Stalin's plans reversed Lenin's NEP retreat, prioritizing coercion over compromise, while NEP stabilized, plans modernized brutally, enabling WWII victory, but at totalitarian cost. Industrialization, collectivization, and terror. Stalin's rule from the late 1920s brought rapid, brutal transformation. The first five-year plan, 1928-1932, aimed to industrialize the agrarian USSR through massive state investment in heavy industry, steel, coal, machinery, achieving growth but at enormous human cost, including urban overcrowding and famine. Collectivization merged peasant farms into state-controlled kolkhozy, targeting kulaks, better-off peasants, as class enemies. Resistance led to executions, deportations, and the Holodomor famine in Ukraine, 1932-1933, killing millions. The Great Purge, 1936-1938, or Great Terror, epitomized Stalin's paranoia. Triggered by Sergei Kirov's assassination, possibly on Stalin's orders, it engulfed the party, army, intelligentsia, and ordinary citizens. Show trials liquidated old Bolsheviks like Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and most Red Army officers were executed, weakening Soviet defenses. The NKVD arrested 1.5 million, executing about 700,000. Gulags swelled with political prisoners. Stalin reversed course in 1938, blaming NKVD chief Nikolai Yezhov, whom he scored Bobby. Leadership during World War II. Hitler's invasion on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, caught Stalin unprepared despite warnings. Stunned, he retreated to his dacha before rallying. Renaming the fight the Great Patriotic War, he appealed to Russian nationalism over communism, appointing himself Supreme Commander. Initial disasters, Moscow threatened, Leningrad besieged, vast territories lost, gave way to victories at Moscow, 1941-42, Stalingrad, 1942-43, and Kursk, 1943, where the Red Army turned the tide, aided by Lend-Lease aid and mass mobilization. Stalin met Allied leaders at Tehran, 1943, and Yalta, 1945, securing Soviet spheres in Eastern Europe and promising to enter the Pacific War. The USSR suffered 27 million deaths but emerged victorious, occupying Eastern Europe and installing communist regimes. Stalin's leadership was ruthless: penal battalions, scorched earth, mass deportations, but effective in mobilizing a nation for survival. Post-war years and death. After 1945, Stalin rebuilt amid the Cold War. He purged returning POWs as traitors, consolidated the Eastern Bloc, and launched renewed industrialization while maintaining terror against cosmopolitans and Jews. The 1948-1953 doctor's plot accused Jewish physicians of plotting his murder, signaling another purge wave. A stroke in 1945 weakened him. Paranoia deepened. On March 1, 1953, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage at his Kuncevo dacha after a party. Aides, fearing reprisal, delayed aid until March 5th, when he died. His body lay in Lenin's mausoleum until 1961. Stalin industrialized the USSR, won a world war, and built a superpower, but at the cost of 60 million lives through famine, purges, and camps. Revered in some quarters as a wartime hero, he remains a symbol of totalitarian evil elsewhere.